after the whole project was finished, because they realized that it was not just about the wall. It was about the people of Jerusalem. Because once the wall was lying in ruins like that, and the temple itself was lying in ruins, the people were in danger. The people of God were in danger. So they understood that. So in chapter 10, starting in verse 34, I'll read a few parts of the passage up to verse 39. It says, we, the priests, the Levites, and the people, so everybody, the whole community in Jerusalem, we assume the responsibility for bringing to the house of the Lord each year the first fruits of our crops and of every fruit tree. So after this was done, they said, well, the temple still needs to be raised up again. We still need to have our communal life going again, because their whole life revolved around the temple of God. And in verse 7 they say, we will bring to the storerooms of the house of our God, to the priests, the first of our ground meal, of our grain offerings, and of the fruit of all our trees, and of our new wine and olive oil. And we will bring a tithe of our crops to the Levites. All of them took a pledge to say, this is what we will do. In verse 39, the people of Israel, including the Levites, are to bring their contributions of grain, new wine, and olive oil to the storerooms, where the articles for the sanctuary and for the ministering priests, the gatekeepers, and the musicians are also kept. And they finish by saying, we will not neglect the house of our God. We will not neglect the house of our God. My appeal to you today, let's not neglect the church of God. God expects each one of us to pitch in and do what He called us to do. Let us not neglect the work He had given us. But even though you saw that pledge that they had made, Nehemiah went back to his work where he used to work, and years later he receives bad news. Although the world was rebuilt, the pledges were made, things were not happening. It says in chapter 13, verse 6, but while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Some time later, I asked his permission and came back to Jerusalem just to see what's going on since I was here. Guess what he found? Guess what he found? So he found that things had gone wrong. The storeroom in the temple was being rented out to some guy. Some guy didn't have enough storeroom at his house, and he asked, I see you have a storeroom in the temple. Can I use it? They said, yes, you can. And the reason they said he can is because it was empty. The people were no longer bringing the stuff they were supposed to bring. So the storeroom at the temple was standing empty. And somebody said, well, I can pay you some rent. Let me use it. So when he got there, he found this storeroom full of stuff of some guy. And then in verse 10 he says, I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them. The Levites were supposed to be the people who minister at the temple. They are not supposed to be working on the fields. But because they were not getting the portions to survive, they decided to go work for themselves. And that's what we are today. The generation of the people who were standing here earlier, they don't know a time when their pastors were working from Monday to Friday and over the weekend to do church work. They know pastors who were employed by the church to do the work of God from Sunday to Sunday. But today in this country, we don't have one minister who is paid by the church. The Levites have left the temple. They are working to survive. That's not right. We can't have that. That's the days we need to go back to. That's the Jerusalem, that's the church we need to go back to. Because I feel so bad sometimes when I'm at work and I get a call, somebody sick in hospital, they need somebody to pray for them. And I can't go. Because I'm working to feed my kids. And God doesn't want that. A few years ago, there used to be talk about We are like Paul, who used to make tents, and I'm not like Paul. You see, Paul managed his own time. If he needed to go, he can stop if he decides to stop making tents and do what he needs to do. I can't do that. I'm employed by somebody else. My time is controlled by somebody else. I can't go to the hospital when I need to go. And that's not right. So the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and musicians responsible for the service in the temple had gone back to their own fields. And that's what has happened to us. Our ministers, our pastors have gone back to their own fields because there's nothing coming in. We can't look after them so that they can focus on the work they need to do. Now they have to focus in 2 jobs at the same time. And those of your pastors here, they know how difficult that is. One of the 2 is going to suffer. Either your work is going to suffer or the ministry is going to suffer. You can't do both at the same level of proficiency. It can't be done. And the vision that I have is of a future GCI where the walls have been rebuilt and the gates are there and the Levites are at the temple serving the people. That's the picture I have. The picture we used to have. Unfortunately, some of you, the young ones, do not remember that history. Many of the older people know that history. And many are yearning for a day like that. So in verse 11, Nehemiah says, so I rebuked the officials and asked them, why is the house of God neglected? Remember what they said to him earlier? We will not neglect the house of God. But they just did that. Why is the house of God neglected? He says, then I called the Levites together and I stationed them at their posts and asked the people to honor their pledges so that the Levites don't have to go out and work and neglect the work of the temple. This is my appeal today, that you can make a pledge to say, I'm going to take up the challenge to rebuild this church to what God wants it to be. You see, even Paul, who was making tents, he says in 2 Corinthians, he said, even I am like Peter and John and so on. I deserve to be funded in my ministry. I must be funded in my ministry. I'm not supposed to be spending months doing tents when I should be preaching the gospel. This is not how God wanted it to work. Because God knows to serve Him, to do the work that needs to be done by pastors and ministers, it requires full-time dedication. That's why He had a whole tribe called Levites. Do you understand that? He had a whole tribe of people whose job was to look after the temple and the worship of the people of God. Because it can't be done on a part-time basis. When we try to do it on a part-time basis, we are fooling ourselves. It can't be done like that. And I'm appealing to you that you join in this rebuilding job. Let's conclude. In Psalm 27, I want us to just remember that this is not a work of man. This is a work of God. Unless the Lord builds a house, the work of the builders is wasted. Nehemiah was under no illusion that the project of rebuilding the walls and the gates of Jerusalem was his job. He knew it was a work of God. And I want us to understand that what I'm asking you to be part of is a work of God. It is not a work of man. He says, unless the Lord protects the city, guarding it with sentries will do no good. And that's what I want to remind you of. That as we enter this project, we need to give it to God. And say, God, this is your work. I pray that God can touch your heart the same way that Nehemiah's heart was touched. That when he heard and saw the state of Jerusalem, his heart bled. And he said, it can't be like this. I hope you can feel the pain of the state of our church. In Ezekiel 22, verse 30, this is the words of God. I looked for someone who might rebuild the wall of righteousness that guards the land. I searched for someone to stand in the gap in the wall, but I found no one. I'm looking for people who are willing to stand up and say, let's rebuild. I hope it is not true that there's no one here who wants to do it. During Ezekiel's time, there was no one willing to stand up. And my appeal is that the old people are still standing. I was very impressed during the singing. Probably one or two were sitting down. The old people here who are in their 70s and 80s were standing when we were worshiping. These are not people who are tired. These are people who still have strength. And I want to call upon the younger ones of us to say we can look at these old people and say, if they are still standing, why am I sitting down? If they still can get up on a Sunday morning and come to church, what excuse do I have? If they are willing to give a tenth of their pension, what excuse do I have? Because one of the things I see that because I look at the numbers at the records, and this is a shame for us young people, that our church today financially is being carried by old people. If I divided the people 50 and above and 50 and below and look at per capita offerings, the younger people are giving like 20 rand a month. The older people are giving like 3,000 a month. It can't be. These are people who are paying out of pension money. And the younger people of us who are still working and earning good incomes, we can't afford to give a 20 rand. That's why I think we need to look up to these old people, because the church I'm talking about, which employed, I don't know how many pastors we had in this country. We had so many. In some churches, we had 3 or 4 employed pastors in one church, in one congregation. It was because these people know what it means to be faithful to the work of God. And they haven't forgotten that they are still faithful today. And that's something that we, the young people, can learn from. Because if we can do that, this church can do all of that. We can move out of this classroom and have our own building. We can hire a pastor who can look after us 24/7. We can, because it was done before. And I know there are small churches like this who are doing it because the people are committed to do it. So I'm calling upon each one of us to do that.